Good afternoon, Acting Interim Chair. I'm Ricky Stone from the Umzimvubu Farmers Support Network.
Welcome. You the first one to present?
We are indeed, Chair.
Thank you very much. You have 20 minutes for your presentation, and thereafter we'll engage in questions and clarities. So please go ahead.
Honourable Chairperson, honourable members of the Portfolio Committee on Justice and Correctional Services, and members of civil society. I'm a proud South African, and my name is Ricky Stone. I'm a practicing attorney by profession, but today I appear before you in my capacity as a director of the Umzimvubu Farmers Support Network. The main beneficiaries of our organization are the hundreds and thousands of rural subsistence cannabis farmers in the Amampondo region, known culturally and traditionally as the Amampondo draconian. The Amampondo have farmed cannabis and traded it lawfully for over 300 years. Their specific indigenous cannabis cultivars are well known to contain some of the DNA of the modern day cannabis. Some of the founding objectives of the UFSN were to assist our farmer beneficiaries with a legal challenge against the government's discriminatory drug policy of forced aerial eradication of the illicit cannabis crops in the region for over 2 decades, using a known cancer-causing herbicide, glyphosate, which was sprayed from SAPS helicopters onto cannabis waterways, farmlands, livestock, homesteads, and people. Secondly, to advocate for legal and economic policies that include historical cannabis-producing communities in the emerging legal cannabis industry. And thirdly, to bridge the gap between our beneficiaries and the government so that their heritage wealth may be activated and their indigenous knowledge on cannabis preserved. Some of our cannabis credentials as an organization: in 2016, we invoked a legal strategy to put an end to the aerial eradication of indigenous cannabis farms in Amampondo land by the SAPS, and this challenge was ultimately successful. In 2017, we submitted detailed comments on the MCC, which is now SAPRA, on their guidelines on the cultivation of cannabis and the manufacture of cannabis-related pharmaceutical products. Disappointingly, that submission was not even acknowledged, and clearly, none of our submissions were even taken into account in the final guidelines. Later in 2018, we made a submission to the 64th session of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The purpose of the submission was to highlight the genuine plight of the Amampondo legacy cannabis farmers, the SAPS's aerial eradication program using glyphosate, and to alert the committee to the fact that these legacy farmers are being left behind in the great green gold rush. The outcome of our submission was that the committee stated that they are concerned about the use of glyphosate, which was classified as probably carcinogenic by the International Agency for Research on Cancer of the World Health Organization, in the aerial spraying of cannabis crops to control the illicit cultivation of cannabis in the Pondoland region. The committee went on to recommend that the state party, South Africa, suspend such aerial spraying and instead offer alternative development programs to the affected communities to encourage them to abandon the illicit cultivation of cannabis, including, and I emphasize that, the possibility of participating in the medical cannabis market through a licensing program for small-scale community farmers. Due to the sheer remoteness of the UFSN beneficiary communities, many who still do not have access to basic services, such as electricity, potable water, and sanitation services, public participation and consultation commands a new meaning. Accordingly, we submitted a request to the committee to extend the deadline for written submissions on the bill from 9 October 2020 to a date 6 months thereafter. An extension was, of course, granted, but only until 30 November 2020. Notwithstanding that, we submitted our written submissions on that day. The written submissions were acknowledged by the committee secretariat on 23 August 2021, which was only 1 day before the department's presentations last week. During those presentations last week, the Honourable Chairperson mentioned in session on the 24th of August that the public hearings would be held next week. UFSN placed on record that 7 days is far too short a time in which to meaningfully consult with and prepare our beneficiaries ahead of making these oral representations. Nonetheless, I've made arrangements, despite the obvious logistical challenges, to ensure that one of my fellow directors, Makosi Greekson Zweni, a traditional doctor and healer in Lusikisiki and Pondoland, and Chief Luthando Dinwayo, the chief of one of our core constituencies, that they have made arrangements in Lusikisiki and they will speak after me.
I'm Chief Dinwayo from Manhlaneni in Lusikisiki. I represent a large number of people who trade on cannabis. They've been trading since time immemorial. These people, most of them are illiterate and poorest of the poor. To alleviate their plight, they've been trading in cannabis for many years. What we are also against as the people is the licenses, because people have been trading on this plant and they've been growing this plant for years. For years, they've been growing cannabis. Now they are told they have to have licenses for them to grow this plant. We feel it is unfair to them because this is what they know. They've been living off this plant for years. And we would also like to thank the Umzimvubu Farmers Network for helping us with the spraying of cannabis, because initially the spraying, when it went on, there were adverse consequences that happened to our people, because the spraying happened indiscriminately. The fields, people's fields where they grow their crops, maize and stuff, it was also sprayed by this chemical, which was detrimental to the people's livelihood. And even their animals were affected because the spraying went on indiscriminately. We also reject the bill because we were never consulted. For instance, in the bill, there is where it says children are not allowed to be exposed in the ganja, and but traditionally we work with our children in the fields. We work the dacha with them, and we see nothing wrong with that because it is a crop that is helping the whole family. With that, I thank you. I will now hand over to my colleague, Mr. Zweni.
Hi, Tamaku. My name is Greekson Nthombela Zweni, Director of Umzimvubu Farmers Support Network, and also a traditional doctor. I'm with other directors. Firstly, the bill denies us our cultural and indigenous rights. Where medicinal, we use this for many diseases, serious diseases. Even the COVID-19, we mix in our mixers for treating it. Never mind that we're undermined and not even checked and listened to. We also mix cannabis on this. We use it for many rituals. We use it as a feed for animals. We use it as a contraceptive. We also use it as a high income generating commodity, because many people use cannabis, but not all of them grow it. So for generation and generation, for those who don't grow it, They were buying it from those who are growing it. And this actually boosted Pondoland in many ways. Find many people, though there are no industries, there are no income generating big projects in the area, but the area is growing like any other area. So it's disturbing all our life. Actually, the bill is actually destroying our culture and marginalizing us to be the poorest, more than the poorest of the poor. And if you look at it properly, it's actually enriching the very rich. When you look at the requirements for one to have a license, it's talking of millions, and we don't have such money. We therefore recommend that at least one household is given 1 hectare, because when you take a healing, I have to burn a quantity which will be given to me by my ancestors. Now with 4 plants or 8 plants, it means I will burn once, and after that I won't be able to obey the instruction from my ancestors. We also recommend that when you regulate cannabis, it should be regulated in a cannabis farmer-friendly manner, so that the farmers benefit from this emerging industry, e.g. allowing hubs of the cannabis to be the main suppliers from this province. We also recommend that the government should assist cannabis farmers to grow cannabis legally and be able to compete with the world market and the world growers. We therefore then see that this bill is actually not really necessary for it. We don't need a bill for this. Instead, we need consultations which will include all the necessary stakeholders, so that we come up with a bill that really is a South African bill, not a bill done for the rich people and foreigners.
Chair, in last week's session, the Eastern Cape provincial government had made submissions on behalf of the Amampondo farmers and the Eastern Cape. Of course, we are eternally grateful to our provincial government for taking the effort to consult with her people and for their written submissions and oral representations. We are very proud of our provincial government for being the only province to do that, and for their determination to ensure that the Eastern Cape is recognized as a cannabis mecca of South Africa. But for the sake of Hansard, and with due deference to the House and to the provincial government, it is necessary to correct the record. The Eastern Cape provincial government convened 4 meetings. These were in Lusikisiki, Umtata, East London, and Gqeberha. No meetings were convened at any of the respective Kumkulus and traditional authorities. The UFSN and our indigenous farmer beneficiaries reject the assertion that the people of the Eastern Cape accept that SAPRA should be responsible for medical cannabis licenses and provincial government for hemp permits. This is patently incorrect. SAPRA does not possess the legislative authority, Chair, to regulate the cultivation of cannabis in any form. Their mandate only enters when it comes to processing and manufacture of cannabis. Their conduct accordingly remains ultra vires. We are of course at pains to point out that hemp is not a plant. It's a word only. It's a term used to describe the industrial applications of the cannabis plant. The arbitrary THC levels of 0.2 to 0.3% beseeched of the cannabis plant for it to be deemed hemp. They are a fallacy, an illusion of grandeur, and a product of prohibition. This narrative should be retired immediately. It is certainly not fit for purpose. The indigenous cannabis farmed by the Amampondo can be used for industrial or hemp purposes. It has been so used for centuries. What we submit is that we need a one-plant philosophy. Cannabis is dacha, is nsangu, is umya, is hemp, whether it's rope or dope. And of course, this is very important. We have to reserve our rights. We've indicated what constitutionally mandated public participation demanded of government. What has occurred is mere lip service with respect. These oral representations in no way should be construed as a waiver of our rights to meaningful public participation, nor does our participation in provincial government's consultatus process account to any waiver. Our rights and those of our beneficiaries are therefore strictly reserved. And importantly, in terms of customary, cultural, and indigenous rights, South Africa has a plural legal system consisting of the common law and customary law. Both of these legal systems are subject to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Indigenous law is entrenched in terms of the IKS Act and the UNESCO Draft Declaration on Cultural Diversity, and recognized by the World Intellectual Property Organization, who have said that traditional knowledge is not so-called because of its antiquity. It is a living body of knowledge that is developed, sustained, and passed on from generation to generation within a community, often forming part of its culture or spiritual identity. We, of course, then reserve our beneficiaries' rights to continue to cultivate, use, and lawfully trade cannabis in terms of their entrenched customary and indigenous law rights. These customary and indigenous rights are the only form of license the Amampondo farmers should require. Our recommendations, and the only rational one, is that the bill is scrapped in its entirety. It will certainly do more harm than it seeks to prevent. It has strikingly been incorrectly tagged as a Section 75 bill, and the content is unconstitutional. If ever there was a Tumamina moment for Honorable President Ramaphosa to invoke his executive powers in terms of Section 1 of the Constitution, then this is it. And we would impress upon the President, Chair, that he makes such executive orders to the effect that there will be no more arrests for cannabis offences whatsoever, which is in line with the Prince judgment and the directive from the National Commissioner of Police. 2, the Drugs and Drug Trafficking Act does not apply to cannabis which is used for industrial purposes, i.e. for hemp purposes. This is consistent with a purposive legislative interpretation read with the International Drug Control Conventions. By doing this, and by the President writing this executive order, will permit the Amampondo farmers to immediately sell their tons and tons of cannabis fiber and biomass to put food on the table. And finally, South Africa must take steps to accede to the Geneva Act of the Lisbon Agreement on appellations of origins and geographical indications. By doing so, we'll be afforded the opportunity, together with the Ngoya Protocol, to seek compensation for the many decades of biopiracy, where the indigenous cannabis varieties, as I mentioned earlier, consist of the DNA. These have been culturally appropriated for decades. There are not proper benefit sharing agreements in place, and we certainly need them. I would like to thank you, Nkosi Ndiabulela Kamagu. Thank you, Chair.
All right, thank you very much. As you concluded your presentation, I hope you did not leave one or two of those specific questions that were asked from you to clarify.
I've noted the questions, Chair, and I will clarify them.
Quick, briefly, please.
Okay, so the question from Honourable Member Ngola: what do we want? What does UFSN want? What do we suggest in respects of permitting? It is just unrealistic to think that you can single-handedly give each individual in the Amampondo, in the communities, a license. So what we are suggesting is that cannabis be regulated at the point of processing. It can quite simply be done. It's been done in other countries such as Jamaica, Colombia, and more recently in Morocco. It is done through a cooperative system, primary cooperatives and secondary cooperatives. The current narrative is the Western narrative, where the Amampondo, as other Africans, are deemed to be a source of low-cost labor. This should not be the case. These farmers have the skills, and it would be more realistic to then regulate at the point of processing. So at a cooperative hub where cannabis can be graded and weighed and processed accordingly. We believe that that is something which is very realistic and is fit for purpose to South Africans. Then, Honourable Minister Nivo Draken's questions, our input on the master plan. Unfortunately, we have not submitted any input on the master plan for the simple reason in that we were again only afforded, and this was around the Easter weekend, during the session by the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform, we were told to submit, anybody listening in on the session, to submit comments on the master plan within a period of 7 days. That included the Easter long weekend. Of course, as you will now note and appreciate, Chair, due to the geography and the locality, it is simply impossible to take meaningful comments and hold consultations in those regions within a period of 7 days, particularly over the sacred Easter weekend. Now, we then wrote to the department. We asked especially for a copy in isiXhosa so that our people can understand what the master plan entails. We've reserved those rights. We are waiting for the final version of the master plan to be gazetted. And once it is gazetted, we will then, of course, submit very comprehensive and guiding comments on the master plan. And then finally, the final question, in respect of the spraying, is it still happening and were there any side effects? No, the spraying is not happening. It started in the late 90s. Due to our legal intervention, it was stopped in 2016. There have been many side effects, and these are still being explored as to what needs to be done. But there are high rates of cancer in the region. Our South African Medical Research Council has done research which clearly shows that there are increased incidences of esophageal cancer, which is in the throat, and also a very rare form of cancer called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Chair.
Thank you. We appreciate your input and presentation. We've just gone out of our time. We appreciate, thank you for coming. I will now ask us to go to the next presentation, Sia, and as I